So we just wanted to run a little session today. We're going to be running for about 45 minutes. As I say, please feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go through the session. And again, we'll have contact details at the end. We just decided, Adam and I, we do a lot of online surveys, a lot of work around online surveying. We thought it might be useful to present something about some fundamentals about mastering online surveys. And we're going to just kick off with just a brief consideration of their value. Typically, their effectiveness in generating responses at volume and speed, and also they are interesting and useful in terms of cost effectiveness, particularly where we are looking at, sorry, it's just letting someone in, looking at responses, cost per response. There's Adam's going to talk at greater detail about the different software suites and systems available that mean that we've got a greater range of, in terms of cost, available to us in terms of survey softwares, and the intrinsic value of quantitative models of research mean that we can typically test theories, we can generalize from data, we can look at large data sets and sets of responses, and from those we can determine trends in, let's say, for instance, awareness, attitudes, and perhaps even behaviors. We can benchmark studies over time, although one thing that I would caution against is what my colleague and friend Jim Murphy calls nude quant. In other words, benchmarking for the sake of benchmarking, as opposed to where there might be some opportunity cost, and it would be better to actually generate and consider new questions in an online survey. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Some of the challenges in online surveying, sometimes it can be really challenging to understand the reasoning behind particular answers because there's not sufficient space for a respondent to explain their rationale why they've answered a particular way. Sometimes we might have a sample, we might have a population in the study that's not representative of the broader population that we're particularly interested in, or we might have a set of answers that are skewed in a particular way and we misinterpret those, so there's danger, there can be danger there. Again, space might mean that the fact that respondents are reluctant to type at length means that there may be a limited opportunities available for respondents to express themselves and provide a more in-depth, colourful and sort of detailed answers. And again, we're restricted by the fact that we're typically predetermining questions. We've got a set of predetermined questions. There's limited flexibility in the question set. Thanks, Adam. And
then the big thing for me, before you even get into developing your online surveys, is really considering the importance of planning. I think often projects, there can be such a rush to get a survey out, they've not given the time that it really needs. And there are three things that, in quite simple terms, that I try to think about when developing the survey, and that's what you need to ask. So not even the specific questions, but thinking about your research objectives, the topics you want to cover. So it might be that you've already got some data available from other sources, but it really help you. You might, depending on how complex it is, trying to build that into some kind of framework. And the second one is who you need to ask. So that's think about your audience, and that might be considering where you need to get the survey out to, but it might also be how you develop the survey, how you design it so that it's accessible for the people you want to reach. And the third area is when you need to ask them. So there are a couple of considerations there. It could be about the audience. So when's the best time for them? So if you're hitting things like school holidays, might not be the best time for people to be able to respond. But also about you as well and your project. So if it's a benchmarking project, for example, thinking about the time of year that you're doing it, because that can have an impact on the data. But also things like evaluations as well. Timing is really crucial in terms of getting your surveys out at the right time.
So just some thoughts about questions and questionnaires. firstly, typically we recommend this particular order. I won't read the slides out, but start with some of the more basic questions. Have qualifying questions earlier on. So if you're looking to speak to teachers, really good idea, or research among teachers as a group, really good idea to ask the question, are you a teacher, pretty early on. So and filtering out respondents that don't fit the profile through the survey logic to a final or penultimate slide. Look at, or question I should say, grouping questions by their theme so that you have sort of similar questions in groups. I often see surveys where that can be sporadic and a little haphazard, but we want as respondents to have kind of sense in the order of our questionnaires. But typically it's recommended to place demographic questions at the end because they generally will be the least important questions, those filtering and segmentation questions, and some of the core questions that you're looking to answer. If you've got very important demographic questions, so it's fundamental that you understand segmentation according to, let's say, age group, and you might want to put that question higher up the pecking order in the survey. If we're looking to assure anonymity in our questions, then do beware that if you're, let's say, incentivizing a survey and you've got a prize draw, for, let's say, you can enter a prize draw, it's often recommended, I'd recommend that the link to the prize draw is external to the survey itself, so that the respondent is assured that you're not collecting their email and name through the mechanics of the survey, and that there's no link effectively between the two data sets. And beware, often a lot of survey software collects automatically IP addresses or geolocation data or invitation data which can identify an individual. So again, it's important to ensure that you're in the response toolkit of your survey software, you're clicking the right buttons to make sure you're not collecting that data. Obviously, it's about making sure that the survey is not too long, simplicity of language, and really basic points. I often see surveys where there is let's say, a qualitative question where you're asking someone to explain themselves, but the space given to provide an answer is too short for them to answer effectively. So the column width within the design of the survey just needs adjusting. Thanks, Alan. Questions to avoid, things to make sure that you don't do. So, example of a leading question would be, should conscientious parents teach their children for more than 2 hours a day? Double barrel question example might be, do you think driving tests should focus more on approaching roundabouts and maintaining safe distance on a motorway? So you've got two factors there, and it will be impossible to unpick whether the respondent is responding based on one factor or the other, or both. Long words, questions that are too long, questions that the answers to which you can't use. Assumptive questions, example there would be, when you eat ice cream, do you prefer the vanilla flavour? That presumes that a respondent eats ice cream. Ambiguity, so I'm just missing something. Hi, Rosie. An example of an ambiguous question, do you think your family would recommend our services? Well, which part of your family and which services? Social desirability, so it's very important not to establish a social norm that might influence the way that a question is answered. So an example of this might be, most people say they like this, to what extent do you agree? And then negatives, we sometimes see questions with double negatives in, such as, I don't think this service should not be made free, true or false. That was a question I actually saw recently. So, simply because they're confusing, to say the least. Thanks, Ellen. Just thinking about scales, we often use scales on online surveys and other research methods, but specific to online services, there can be a really useful way of asking a question, and they make the most out of digital publishing layouts. Setting the interval, it's really important that the ends of the scale are opposites and that there is a neutral point. It's worth pointing out an error that's often made, confusion between don't know and, in this case, mixed feelings. The be at a neutral point about an issue is not the same as to not have an opinion about it or be unsure about it. So it's really important in the analysis to differentiate between those two factors. And just in terms of ranking, often software tools have quite sophisticated selection and ranking question formats. If you are using these, they can be sometimes they're drag and drop. It's just worth stressing that in the analysis, ranking is a explication, a kind of demonstration of preference. It's not necessarily one of strength. So if you're asking me to use the ice cream analogy, which I'll continue using today, do I prefer vanilla, strawberry, or chocolate? If I say, strawberry, chocolate, vanilla, I'm telling you that which I prefer. I'm not telling you my strength of feeling. I might hate the other two. Where too much choice in ranking matrices, in particular, which can be bewildering, we struggle to deal with selecting and ranking beyond a certain set of choices, and also where we have ranking matrices, where we're ranking by a variety of different factors. So, which of these is vanilla, which of these ice cream flavors is A, your favorite, and B, your the one that you've bought recently. It's just difficult sometimes to think of multiple considerations at the same time.
Yes, so Ben's touched a lot on the kind of question design, but I'll just focus a little bit on the actual survey mechanics and design. The big thing for me is around the experience of the end user and the respondent and making it as easy as possible. So a lot around the length and simplicity of language Ben has covered, but there's also a lot you can do with the functionality of your software these days. So thinking about how you can use options like logic and routing. So for example, if you've got a section on feedback on the website, but you might want to consider having a question up front around, do they use the website? Yes, no, because some of those questions might not be relevant to them. Some have functionality called piping as well. So you can, so I'm going to carry on with the ice cream themed, but which ice creams have you had in the last 12 months? And then you can pipe through those options to then ask which was the favorite and things like that. But principally all about using the functions to make it a seamless experience for the user and to answer as few questions as possible to get the most out of the data. Another point around restricting the responses. So you'll be asking them probably a mix of single choice, multiple choice, top 3 questions, making sure what you want the respondent to provide an answer to marries to the kind of functionality and limits you've set within the software, so that it isn't possible for them to provide multiple responses if you only want a single choice, for example, because you'll pay for it when it comes to the analysis because the data won't come together. The other one is around accessibility. It's really come on in the last few years, and it's really quite simple now to use some of that software to make it a lot easier for people who might not be able to access it in the same ways as some people. So, for example, you can quite easily just add a low vision mode where they can click a button and it comes up in a different resolution, different font sizes, things like that. And translated options are also a lot slicker these days. You would still have to put the work and the resource in to translate it effectively, because Google Translate won't necessarily capture like the local kind of context of that, but there's a lot you can do there. And the big learning for me here is testing and piloting. It comes back to the timing issue I mentioned earlier on. Give yourself that time to test and pilot it before it goes out and find those issues, rather than sending it out into the wild and then letting the respondents find those issues for you, because that makes your life a lot harder. Next one is around thinking about mobiles. Those top 2 stats there kind of drill home what we probably all know to a degree, just how much smartphones are used these days, but also how much they're used for survey responses. And this is in bold is the kind of key point for me, is that every survey software will tick that box and say that they're mobile adaptive, but it doesn't mean that your survey is going to be mobile friendly. They're the kind of decisions and design choices that you've got to make. So Ben mentioned earlier around those big horrible grid questions where you might have you've effectively got 10 or 12 questions within one, which is fine on paper or on a desktop, but when it comes to mobile, they'll probably feed through as individual questions, so that's not a great experience for them. Some of the fancy interactives you can do these days are great, like buckets and sliders and things like that, but they're not necessarily that great for mobiles. They can be quite fiddly, so factor that in. Open questions, again, can give you really rich insights, but too many of those it's going to be really slow going for the respondent. And also the number of response options. If you imagine the size of a mobile phone screen, if you start to have more than 5, 6, 7 responses, that's probably going to scroll down and not be the greatest experience. And again, they're just a general point of testing and piloting, particularly on different types of devices, to see how it looks and feels. Last point on the kind of design side of it is GDPR and privacy. Like GDPR, I think, has got almost a bad rap sometimes, because everyone associates it with a couple of years ago where it just landed us with a load of work. But actually, the principles are really sound, and really it's around data privacy and being a lot more open and upfront, and people understanding how their data is being used. So the one piece of advice I would always have is make sure you've got privacy notice, where you can kind of set some of those steps out, and it helps you think about that process as well. So where is the data being stored? Checking your third-party apps and software to see how they're storing it, what you're going to do with that data, how long you're going to keep it for, and the basis on which you're collecting that, what they can do if they're unsure. The other thing to do as well is try and get active and informed consent. And again, that's quite straightforward with an online survey up front. You can have a bit of a tick box to confirm that they've done that. But I think it's always about getting that balancing act. We've both talked earlier on about making it as simple as possible. So making sure as well they're not just landing to a 1,000-word essay on like all the stuff around data, because it might be a bit of a turn off.
Just some principles around recruiting respondents, the right types of respondents. We find in studies, whether they're online, involving online surveys, whether they're qualitative, quantitative, that a common denominator in relation to a respondent's propensity to become involved in a research study is often whether they feel they have some sort of stake within the organisation, they have some sort of relationship and some level of familiarity. So researching amongst publics or stakeholders, whichever term you want to use, with little or no familiarity with the organisation is always going to be a more significant challenge than would be the case among those that have some level of familiarity. Independent of relationship, do avoid surveying amongst those that you may have yourselves been surveying intensely, or even less regularly than that. So let's say, for instance, for an internal communications piece of research, it's always useful to understand to the extent to which that group have been surveyed recently. But more generally, if you've got intelligence that a particular group has been subject to a number of stakeholders a number of surveys by other organisations, then it's worth taking that into account as to whether they should be targets for your particular study. The literature on incentivisation is inconclusive, in particular whether things like prize draws generate a meaningfully larger number of respondents than if you're not running a prize draw. I have to say, in our experience, they've been positive in terms of when we compare them against studies where those haven't been employed. But a mixed model can work particularly well, and by that I mean where there is a reward for the individual potentially through a prize draw mechanism, and then where at the end there may be a donation to charity for every completed answer up to a set number, so that obviously you're not bankrupting the client or yourselves if you go over, or if you collect a huge amounts of responses. But that can, particularly if the charity means something to the respondent group, that can be a really useful model of helping particularly generate higher completion rates than you might otherwise have. So people are incentivized to get to the end of the survey, raise that 50p or £1 for the charity that they feel an affiliation with. If looking at internal communications in particular, or internal employee-facing surveys, do your endeavours have the support of a senior team, of the HR function, of the leadership, in order to help recruit to that particular study? And then thinking about whether the study itself, the group that you have responded to your survey, do they represent the broader population of the study? That's obviously a very important conceit. If you are looking to analyze the results and retrofit your respondent group against the population under study, that can be a very complex enterprise to adjust it so that the demography, let's say the gender, the ethnicity, age, etc., matches that of your population under study. Because simply if you adjust the gender within a, let's say, a respondent group, that might have an effect on the proportion of different age groups, which then again knocks it out of whack. So again, it's just to bear in mind that sometimes that balancing act can be can be quite complex and delicate way of doing things. Sometimes a different approach is simply stratified sampling, where you're knocking out every X respondent so that they fit the population under study more adequately. Another way of approaching it is to take into account the differences between your respondent group and the populations under study in your reporting. So, say for instance, you've got a higher population of males in your respondent group than you have in your population that you're particularly interested in. Let's say the ice cream aficionados of West Yorkshire, and there's more males in your study group than there are actually proportionally the males who eat ice cream in West Yorkshire. Then just it's something to take account of when you're reporting. It's not necessarily the case that you'd want to adjust the analysis of your respondent responses.
And if you're really struggling, then just get Marcus Rashford on the case, and he'll. So the next one is assuming that you've got the kind of responses that you want, is what you do with the data then. So just a few bits on the analysis process. So first of all, is before you dive in, is get to know your data a little bit. So when I say clean it, look for things like you might find, depending on how you've set up your survey, that you've got partial responses and complete responses. So deciding what you're going to do with that. Quite a lot of the software will quarantine responses where it feels like it's either been a duplicate or that there is some issue with it. So taking a look at that, and then also looking at what you can do with the questions you've already got. So you might have asked the postcode, for example, and you might want to then create a new variable that captures it into location areas. Or you might have asked a question with a lot of response options and you want to consolidate those down. So there's quite a lot you can do before you even start analysing to kind of get to know your data and get it in a shape that will work for you. Within a lot of the software options now, there's quite a few bits of analysis that you can do, and they tend to be segmentation, crosstabs and filters. So segmentation is obviously, as it sounds, is it can create different segments for you to kind of have a look at different profiles of your data set. So you can use multiple variables there as well. So it might be you're doing a membership survey and you want to look at across the membership level and type of membership. So you might have family premium members versus family standard members and things like that. You can definitely do lots with that. Crosstabs. So traditionally they were always those big, massive data sets where you've got every single question cut by 3 or 4 key variables. But there's a lot you can do now that quite looking at one question versus the other. So it might be looking at satisfaction cut by gender or satisfaction cut by age or something like that. But it's a nice, easy way to see like where some of the differences in your data and any kind of significant findings might be. The other one are filters, are quite straightforward to use. So you might be doing a project where you actually, as part of it, need to look at one cut of the data. So it might be, the consultation and your impact assessment has shown that it's likely to have an adverse effect on this particular group of people. You can then apply a filter and start looking at what they're saying. So that's quite useful. One of the biggest challenges with online surveys tends to be if you put open-ended questions in, is what you do with them. Because if you get thousands of responses, you've then potentially got thousands of comments that are really rich and insightful and will add to your analysis. But it's quite hard work to work with. So you could just quite simply export those comments and then just work through them as best you can. Another thing you can do is export them but apply filters. So it might be you export them but filter it by people who are satisfied with your website, and then you've got quite a small pool of comments to work with there. Or most resource intensive is kind of going through it, identifying themes and coding them back, so then you can kind of quantify those. But that is probably your most challenging area of analysis, but actually you'll probably get the most out of it the more time you put into something like that. And the final point is just a general one, and it's your survey. Ben mentioned earlier around like how you would order it to work best for the respondent, but then don't feel like you have to stick to that when you're reporting on it. You'll see quite a lot of reports where they're just churned out based on the order of the survey. Actually think about the questions that are most meaningful and what you want to do with that. So once you've done a bit of analysis, you might want to visualize your data to try, depending on who your stakeholders or audience are. Not going to go into this in huge detail, but there's a lot more to picking the right chart than you might think. In a minute, I'm probably going to pick on pie charts quite a bit, but you'll find a lot in the software that might be the go-to option, but it's not necessarily the right option. The other things to think about is it's not simply the chart, it's how you use things like color. So can you use colour to relate to questions and response options? So it might be satisfaction or agreement scales. You might want to use, green to red is quite a well-used option. And using language as well. So keeping it simple again, it's been the theme of this. And not necessarily just rattling off the name of the question, but actually tell the reader what they're seeing. So X percentage of blah, blah, blah. The other one, final one, is giving it some context as well. So stating the source, the sample sizes, the year of collection, because that survey data might be there for a few years and referred back to, so people need to know what they're looking at. So to give you a few examples, this one I think is just a key point of how simple can be done well. So it's a very simple question, but you can see in the title they've told you what they want you to look at, which is who showed the greatest improvement in efficiency. They've highlighted that colour so it jumps out to you straight away. They've done a really clean way of the grid line, so they've got around any distractions and they've put all the source information at the bottom. So it shows that it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to be like a data whiz to be able to do it. It's just thinking about those design processes. This is a really good example of how you can make a design choice based on different charts. So on the left, you can see the pie chart, which just has so many different colours and so many different options there, versus the exact same data set in a bar chart. And you can see there that there are just too many options to work as a pie chart. There are too many different colours. It's making the reader work really hard. There are also some response options in there that have very similar values, and you just can't pick out that detail in the pie chart. So it just shows how quite quickly switching it from one chart to another can have a big impact on how you present the results. And again, picking on pie charts, so I almost feel like I just should make you sit and look at this for a minute. But if I point you in the direction of those percentages, you'll quite quickly see that should never ever be in a pie chart. So what they've clearly done is taken a multiple response option question, and their producer has said, I want a pie chart, and they've stuck it in a pie chart, but it clearly doesn't work as a pattern. So I would be very mindful of doing anything like that.
Thanks. Just to say, Lauren, thank you very much for your question. We're going to, and everybody else, please feel free to pop questions in the chat if you've got any, and we'll cover all the questions in a few minutes when we finish. Just running through the slides. So, okay, so you've done all this great work. You've engaged with a software solution that works for you, and you've designed a brilliant questionnaire, and you've generated really useful insight. And how do you ensure that it gets used? Well, fundamentally, it's of primary importance that the research answers what we call the exam question that's being set it. Does it provide the insight that it's supposed to generate? And in order for it to do that, the survey needs to be designed with those objectives in mind. And in order for that to happen, you typically, as sort of Adam talked about previously, we need to make sure that we have a clear idea of the who, what, where, when, and how. And typically that information is generated through a research brief. And that research brief includes the question, why are we undertaking this research? What do you want to discover? What are your big questions? And if you can whittle that down to the exam question, the big question, that's even better. So generating the insight that's required, that's number one in terms of a list of ways to ensure that the research actually gets used. we often find that if there isn't the time to adequately commission a piece of research, then there's very unlikely to be the time to use it. So, that initial planning stage can be useful in indicating whether actually there's time among either the internal or the external client for a piece of research, for the thing to actually get put into action. Involving senior teams, or involving those the people that are going to be using the insight in the planning and development of the project and of the survey, and of the sort of early, even earlier planning stages, and perhaps even in the piloting and testing, or certainly in the testing. There are different ways in which to ensure that there's a feeling of ownership by those people that are going to be using the insight that you generate. Just a really small minor tip, but it does help. Having the capacity and the ability to present work rather than just delivering it, let's say through a written report, I find is a really useful way to ensure that there's a broader understanding of the insight. There's opportunities for questions and answers to sort of, and there's a kind of a relationship with the body of work, which increases the likelihood that the things that it's pointing to are going to lead to action.
Yep, and we thought we'd end with a few resources to help, and given that it's all been about online surveys, starting with some different software options. I'm not going to run through the ins and outs of each software option, but I think there's a few key points to think about. Is like I don't think the choices has ever been greater in terms of what's out there, but there's probably no perfect choice. I would think about your context and what you need and test those out. So think about, it depend on your budget and specific requirements for a project, but you'll find you'll have to kind of work through those. Pretty much all of the software options now will give you free access levels. They'll be quite limited in terms of number of responses, the number of questions and things like that. But if it's quite a simple, straightforward survey, that might be something that will work for you. One tip I would give, as I've had it in the past where people have come to me and said they've started it as a free survey with a limited number of responses, then the responses way past their expectations, and then they're stuck with either having to upgrade to access the data, or they've lost a number of responses. So thinking about the likely level of response you're going to get before you make that decision. The other one is around, if you're looking at how to maximize kind of budget at the moment, is around like the monthly options. So you don't necessarily need to subscribe for a year. You quite often you can upgrade and downgrade for a few months to a level that will fit for your purposes. So that's worth thinking about. So if you've got a 3-month project, for example, just upgrading and downgrading for there. They left you with a few survey options there, but I think there are lots of good options, and talk about those if ever anyone wants to. And then just in terms of resourcing tools that I personally find useful, in terms of industry standards, Ben mentioned earlier on around incentives and things like that. Market Research Society have a code of conduct, and it covers all that and more in terms of best practice for delivering all kinds of research. And they're quite good in terms of current trends as well. So things at the moment like around COVID and how you practice safe research at the moment, they've got a lot around that. Someone called Laura Parker is well worth checking out some of the slides that she's produced around user experience and accessibility. They're not specifically around survey software, but they're really useful around how you write and design with your user and audience in mind. Various different analysis tools if you find that the software survey software option isn't quite doing it for you. So free things like Excel, Batch Geo you can do for free as well, up to paid for versions of various different things. But the more you pay for something, the more you're going to have some kind of level of knowledge probably to get the most out of it. Visualizingdata.com is well worth checking out if you want to understand more around the design of your data and analysis. They've got the Chartmaker directory, which is this huge resource of how we can use different tools to create various different charts, and just a massive curation of resources really. And the final one is, if you're just after something quite simple but visual, then checking out Canva or Infogram or places like that that do quite neat infographics. Just
a couple of additional things before we then just answer the questions that have been put, and we'll, Adam and I are going to chat through those. Just following on from Adam's earlier point about qualitative answers, so you know, where you have open questions essentially in particular. Just to give you an idea of resource and also something that's related to another issue which I'm particularly interested in, which is artificial intelligence within survey tools and within research more broadly. In a recent study that we've undertaken, where there were 4 open-ended questions in a questionnaire of, well, let's say, I think 24 questions, the analysis of the 4 open-ended questions, and they were required, and we had to include those for lots of different reasons. The analysis of those questions was took significantly more resource than the analysis of all of the other questions added together by a considerable margin. There aren't, I don't think, really effective sentiment analysis tools that allow you to really effectively analyse questions of that nature available on the market at the moment. So there is always going to be that need, even within the most sophisticated software, for you know, what you might term as sort of grunt work of just going through and coding those questions and then sort of analysing them based on the codes that you've supplied to them. And a couple of other things to mention in terms of resources. There's a really good book if you're really interested in sort of broader resources. Mitchell and Jolly's survey research, really good. There's different editions. I've got the 2012 edition. Really good book on kind of different formats and some of the broader things that we've been talking about. And there's a good book by a man called, I think it's Alan Bryman, and it's Social Research Methods by OUP, and that's published in 2001 again. So I'll put these in the chat later on. But yeah, they're quite useful, broader kind of tomes in relation to this. So we've got some questions here, which I'll just kind of read out the first one, read them out in order, and we'll answer them the best way we can. So first one from Lauren, what are the best ways to do crosstabs? Any particular software recommendations or Excel? Do you want to start with that one, Adam?
Yeah, I think firstly it depends on what you want to do with it. If you're after a massive output where you want to run a big set of data against a few, then like SPSS, for example, is a really good option. They have a free version that someone's open sourced, which have creatively called it PSPP. You worked out what they've done there. But then if you just after quite simple, like almost playing around with your data and creating crosstabs, then like I've used Survey Gizmo, Smart Survey, Snap Surveys, all will have various different crosstab tools in there. So I think it depends on what you want. I've used quite an expensive one called Q Research as well, but I think you've got to be really delivering market research or surveys day in, day out to get the value out of that. But that's probably the most friendly one, I would say.
Just on crosstabs, where we use Survey Gizmo quite a lot, and we've used quite a few of the other suites. We did a test of about 20 different software survey suites at one point a few years ago, and there is a little bit of a danger with crosstabs sometimes of generating these huge tables, even where you're just comparing a few factors. So often it's quite useful to have when you're looking at the software and you're looking at the different tools, sometimes they have sort of summary elements in them that really help with refining the analysis and making the analysis a bit more simplistic. I won't go into much detail, but essentially it's worth mucking about with the crosstab tools to make sure that they fit your needs and they're not overly fidgety. Next question, what's the best way to identify which crosstabs are meaningful to do rather than spending too long on all of them? Well, that's a good question. Adam, what do you think? A question from Colin.
See, well, that's where having some kind of like exhaustive crosstabs can be quite useful, and it's about thinking about the audience as well. So I wouldn't necessarily want to produce a full crosstab for someone else, but if you're quite familiar with the data, you can look at it quite simply. Setting up different variables as well. So if you get a lot better at it, you can create calculations as well, which might be able to identify differences and things like that. But again, it comes back to your point earlier on around the research objectives and things like that. Part of the focus should be around that and making sure that guides how you're looking at the data and questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the crosstabs will sometimes be determined by the the requirement of, if you're particularly interested in understanding the difference between different groups, then they might determine the crosstabs. And Dan asked about, is there, in terms of number of questions, what would you recommend? Is there a broad sweet spot? Again, great question. Personally, there does tend to be a limit in my experience. There's a sort of rough rule of thumb of between 15 and 25. But having said that, that is ridiculously rough, because it does depend upon the logic that you're using within the survey. So you may be shifting people about and leapfrogging different questions based on earlier answers. You may be having a question might be split into different parts. So it's actually, rather than one, as Adam talked about earlier on, it's actually 3 questions in one. I think more usefully, perhaps a way to answer that is that in lots of these new survey tools, there are timing indicators, and they'll give you a sort of idea of how long it's going to take to get through. But even more usefully, because they're not always accurate, is going back to Adam's point earlier on, is piloting and testing, so that you are assured that your respondents aren't being asked to do something that's too long.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
All I would add to, I hate an answer where it starts with "it depends," but I think it does depend on, like, the topic. For example, like, that can have a massive difference on how it drives the response. So sometimes the length is less important than some of the communication around it and how you're targeting it. Because if it's a dull, dry topic, it doesn't matter how many questions you ask, you might struggle to get those responses. But as Ben said, I think testing is the most important thing, particularly if you can get a sample of the kinds of people you're trying to reach as well, because you get a really true reflection. Whereas sometimes we can't see the wood for the trees if you've been developing it, and even if you're showing it around the office, you might not get that true sense. But
yeah. So, any other questions before we finish off? Please don't be shy. Do pop them into chat if you have another question.
No, I feel like we should throw word clouds on the pie chart bonfire as well, as you mentioned, open-ended questions earlier on. And I'm just thinking around the software tools and what they can quite quickly generate for you in terms of analysis. You'll find quite a few have a feature now where if you've got big open questions, there'll be word clouds. And again, I would just have a word of caution there with that, because it, as Ben mentioned, it doesn't get the sentiment through. So it might have dog written up in big, right, but it's not telling you what they're actually saying about the dog and things like that. So I think the more time you can put into working with your tools, the more you'll get out of it. Otherwise, some of these quite visual bits of what feel like analysis might not actually be telling your audience a great deal.
I think a sort of summary piece of advice on open questions is seek wherever possible to limit their use. We had a survey recently which was all about name use and the different names that people use for something. So they were really required. But actually just the analysis was gargantuan, and it often is, particularly where you've got large numbers of respondents. So do be beware of too many open-ended questions. It is always going to be not a chore, but a task to code those and analyze those effectively.
And it's also going to be a task for your respondents to fill them in as well. We've mentioned earlier on around how many people are using smartphones. Like, if you imagine having to type quite lengthy comments in there, that tends to be the area where you can get drop-off reports in some software tools, which are quite useful. So you'll see the kinds of questions where people are dropping off on. You'll find quite often it's the comments questions that you lose them at, because that's where you've almost got to do the thinking, but also the manual part of typing.
And just in terms of speed of response, a sort of plug for mobile, really, many of the survey software suites we're talking about are particularly mobile friendly, and on mobile there's sort of automatic movement between questions, so particularly where they are radio button questions, in other words, single choice, and that will once the respondent has answered, then they're moved on very quickly to the next question. So they can speed through meaningfully, but they're not speeding too quickly, but they can really go through a questionnaire quite quickly, and that can be lead to high completion rates and really generate rich insight. Right, I think that's us done. Anything else to add, Adam?
No, we probably need to go on a mastering Zoom webinars course, don't we?
Well, we were trying to be generous, and yeah. So apologies for the interesting Zoom bomb at the beginning of the session. We were wanted just to bear on the side of openness, because if we closed everything off, we were a bit worried that people wouldn't get in. But with that comes some risk. But anyway, we managed to clear the room fairly quickly. So yeah, thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, great.
All right. Take care, everybody, and thank you.